Hey YouTubers, and welcome back to another real numbers video. I guess this is not necessarily what I always do. Obviously it's not Monday, and it's just kind of more of an update video based on like box office and movie news, movie business and everything. And I just want to say, if I sound a little bit different, I am not using my regular mic. I'm not in my regular place, nor am I using my regular computer right now. I am kind of on vacation, so take that as you will. But personally, I just wanted to kind of cover this very brief story, as it was reported yesterday that Resident Evil, or Sony in general, is already gearing up for a reboot of the Resident Evil franchise after, this past January's the final chapter, which I haven't necessarily seen thus far, but it is one of those concepts that, like, this was kind of something that was to be expected. Just to kind of break it down a little bit, so these movies have never necessarily cost a whole lot to make. I mean, normally they cost around $40 to $50 million, if that. Plus, you got to imagine that they're paying around $80 million to even $100 million just to even kind of put out there. So, and market, advertise, all this other stuff that they actually do. So, when these movies basically come out, and especially the last, I guess, ever since the fourth film, they've really been doing very well. The fourth film, I believe, made $300 million. The fifth film made $240 million. And this last film made the most out of any single one of them, which was $312 million. And what those movies did, combined along with the previous three films, was to basically basically allow this entire series, all six films, to make around $1.233 billion in the worldwide box office over its 15-year run. And I think that that's really an interesting kind of number, especially when you look at how, I guess, not necessarily successful the entirety of the market medium for video game movies has been for Hollywood. They just necessarily can't get them right. And I know a lot of people don't necessarily like the Resident Evil movies. I feel like a lot of people, especially the Resident Evil fans of the video games, feel like they just don't necessarily live up to the quality of the video games, although I'm not necessarily sure what that means anymore, considering the video games have had their fair share of downfalls over the last couple of years. So, or even installments, even though I believe and I've heard that Resident Evil 7 was an upgrade in terms of the survival horror aspect of the original games, but as it were, a lot of people didn't like the films. They've never really been particularly high rated, but it's been a really big money maker for just in general the studio as a whole. So it's not necessarily surprising to hear them talk about some kind of a reboot or something. I mean, they were talking about some kind of a reboot or spin-off series or just a different direction way back before the fifth film even came out. So this is not necessarily the most surprising news. I guess what is surprising, although if you follow this stuff pretty readily, is the fact that they actually usually do this stuff. They put the final chapter or the last film or whatever they need to do to promote this being the very last of whatever particular story they're telling, and we're never going to see another film like this again, basically to boost numbers. And, quite frankly, that's what exactly happened this time. Obviously, just to kind of break it down, that doesn't necessarily mean that the domestic audience fell for it. Like I said, I think we've been kind of going away from these films for a really long time, and if they were to bring it back, they're going to need to, I guess, prove to us in the domestic, in the States and Canada, that this is something worth watching, worthwhile, because even though Resident Evil, the final chapter, did make more money than, I guess, any of the other ones, it only made $26 million, or around $27 million if you estimate upwards. Around that much in its final box office gross, which was the lowest out of any film, especially when you look at it adjusting for inflation. It was definitely the lowest. I mean, this movie made less than the new Underworld movie, which for the most part, the Resident Evil movies did usually perform at least on par or a little better from movie to movie than the Underworld movies. So that was a little bit shocking, at least for me. The one reason this movie made so much money is because it did make around, $159 million in the Chinese box office alone. Plus, they're always well-performing in Japan because that's basically its home country. So that's one of the things that I thought was relatively really interesting about this particular story. They know that there's a market there, but it's not necessarily the domestic market, as I've talked about before in other videos about this particular franchise. So I thought that was pretty interesting nonetheless. So obviously, if they're gearing up for a reboot, they're going to probably take the elements that worked overseas and maybe even just kind of recycle that or do something completely different, that's something that's going to be stupid enough and everything that would work at a much broader scale. So anyone's basically hoping that maybe they would go back to the original format, maybe tell an original story or something closer to the original games, probably shouldn't be looking in that direction. I don't necessarily think that that's what they're looking at. They're going to be taking what worked I guess overseas and do more of that, because obviously there's still a huge market for these films. And another really interesting note here is that with Alien Covenant basically coming out this last week and basically, I guess, reaffirming Alien's top of the roll on the charts of, I guess, horror movies in general. The Alien movies have made more money in terms of any other horror film in general, in terms of, I guess, overall series box office across the world. And obviously that makes a lot of sense. You're talking about 8 films deep that span the greater part of 40 years, or, you know, approaching 50 years by the time, I guess, this new series is basically done. And the one thing I guess is interesting about this is Resident Evil is very close to it. I think on terms, I don't necessarily know the right numbers, but I think it's probably the 3rd highest grossing horror film. I mean, I guess horror film, you know, had action horror, but this would basically, if this new film that they're making in the next couple of years or whatever actually does on par with something like the final chapter, or maybe even better than it because of the renewed interest or something completely different direction, if it can kind of perform domestically and it actually spawns a franchise, then maybe Resident Evil will take Alien's crown away from it and actually be the highest grossing horror movie franchise of all time, which would be really rather interesting. But we're really just going to have to wait and see there. I know Alien Covenant basically just opened up to $36 million, but estimated $36 million, but we're not necessarily sure how it's going to play out in the long run, even though it looks like it's doing pretty well overseas. But still, it's still very early to see exactly how well it's going to do. In my guess, I think we're probably going to get one more sequel to that. I know Ridley Scott has talked about doing 2 more sequels, but he's actually even faltered on that. He's kind of varied whether he wants to actually do that or not in the last few months, considering, you know, not necessarily the warmest reception that Alien Covenant has gotten. So we're just going to have to wait and see. And personally, I just really want to see more of both these franchises. I actually really love both of them. So I'm fine with them doing a reboot this early. It's just, honestly, I feel like I feel like this, and I feel like a lot of Americans feel like this when they promote and tells us that it's the final chapter. I don't think any of us believe them. But looking at the numbers and how these movies usually shake up, it's one of those things where even though we don't believe them, we want to see how they quote-unquote end it, and then we're kind of, I guess, off-put in the last couple months or something when they come up with us. When they come up and they're like, okay, well, now it's time to basically reboot this series and get us in a completely different direction, or continue making these films because they're making too much money for us to basically stop it now. And that's always something that's a little heartbreaking, at least for a fan, for us, that wanted to see how they basically end this stuff and continue to do something more original, something more wholesome, for the most part. But considering their success and basically how every other video game movie basically falls on its ass as soon as it opens, something they kind of just tapped into something that really worked with these films. And honestly, if they're going to keep pushing them out, if they're anything as fun as the original series, then I'm going to be fine with it. But with that being said, I guess I'm just going to put it over to you guys. Like, what do you guys want to see from this particular franchise? Do you want to see them go back to what they did with the original games? Do you want to see them do something else? Would you rather see them continue the story of the original Alien movies that they were making with Alice and everyone else? Do you want to see them completely go in a completely different direction outside of the games or the other movies or anything like that? I mean, I feel like, at least with the games and what I've seen from the movies, there's a big world out there, and as long as you have basically zombies and the Umbrella Corporation, I think you can call it a Resident Evil game and completely get away with it. And if Resident Evil 4 is anything to kind of go off of, you don't necessarily even have to have the Umbrella Corporation in order to get away with any of this stuff. You can basically just keep churning out films that have something to do with zombies and big monster things and anything else that you want to kind of play off of, and maybe even taking good concepts or good good quality storylines from either the games or the movies and reinterpreting them, retelling them in one way or another would actually be pretty helpful for the game. So like I said, please make sure to share your comments in the comment section below. Don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, share this video out to all your friends if you feel like they have something to say or anything like that. And honestly, guys, I'm just going to catch you on the next Real Numbers video, the next Dragon Ball video, the next any other video that I decide to make. Anyway, guys, hope y'all have a good day.